guide series. Got it. So this is the one of our new reports in the Do No Harm Guide project, and I'm going to put the link to the project in the chat window if you want to check it out. So we're focusing on this one on centering accessibility in your work around data and data visualization. There are 4 reports out to date on this in this project. One that you may know about that I believe I've spoken about at least a bit at the DataViz DC a few months ago. Yeah, I see Jill and Will nodding, so time flies. So Alice, Feng, and I wrote the first report in the series on equity awareness and data visualization. We then pulled together an edited volume to highlight other people's perspectives on data equity. We have this report on accessibility and a new report that just came out a couple of weeks ago on equity and data privacy. So those are all hosted at that Do No Harm project site. So I'd encourage you to check all those out. And of course, because the work never ends, we have 3 more coming up that I'll talk about in a second. But let me just introduce all the folks. So there are 3 folks who helped edit this volume. So myself, my colleague at Urban, Sue Popkin, and my former Urban colleague, but now my who I'm a big fan of at Axios now, Alice Feng, helped pull all of this together. And we have, this is a contributed volume. So we have 9 different authors contributing to this volume, each writing a different chapter around different aspects of accessibility, be it alt text, be it different tools, be it PDFs, all these different pieces. And so we're really excited to have some of the people doing this really important work in their day-to-day contribute to this exciting project. And I'm going to give an Urban Blue outline to the 4 folks who are able to join us tonight, who we're going to be peppering with questions and who will share their knowledge with you. So Frank Elavsky from, Frank, what are we saying? Apple and Carnegie Mellon? What are you saying these days?
I will secretly say I don't represent Apple, but yes, I work at Apple.
Okay.
Just on the record. But yeah, I'm at Apple and Carnegie Mellon.
Okay, great. Larene Gassick. Larene, I'm not even sure what your current affiliate. I don't know everybody's current affiliation, so I'm not even going to say it. So I'm looking for Larene somewhere. Oh, there she is. Hi. Yeah.
I'm currently head of technology at a company called Intopia. They're an accessibility consultancy. Fancy title, I have a tiny team of 1.5. So, but yeah, excited to chat with you all.
And what time is it there? It's like...
It's 8:15 in the morning.
Oh, in the morning. Okay, so you're just starting. Yeah. Okay, all right.
I am. I'm coffeeed up.
And we have Doug Schepers. I see Doug somewhere. There he is.
Hi. I'm with Viz Studio. We are a consulting company that works on data visualizations, accessibility of data visualizations specifically.
Yep. And Liz Hare, I saw somewhere.
I'm here. Hi.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Liz. Good to see you. So obviously, these are the folks who are able to join us tonight. Very excited to have them. We're going to have basically a moderated panel discussion that Alice and I are going to moderate, and we are going to pepper them with lots of questions. And we're going to encourage you all to ask your questions as well, be them theoretical, conceptual, or practical, whatever works, whatever you have interest in, and whatever your challenge, especially whatever your challenges are around creating more accessible data visualizations. But before we get into all that, I just want to highlight what are sort of the 5 themes of this particular report. And obviously, I don't think any of us view this report as the end all be all or the answer. I think maybe we raise more questions than we answer, which is frustrating, but also exhilarating in some ways. But I think there are 5 themes that really come through in the work. So the first one, and so the way this worked, just to sort of back up a second, is the Urban Institute, we kind of put out sort of a specific call. I kind of reached out to many of the authors that you see here today, and they connected me with other people. And so it was a pretty well-targeted search for folks who I knew worked in this area. And then we had a couple of calls, and we kind of decided who was going to write on what topic. And then everybody kind of went off on their own and they wrote, and then they sent those essays back to Urban, and myself and Sue and Alice went through and provided comments and edits and tried to create this sort of consistent guide. And so the first thing that really came through, and I think this came through right away in all of the in all the drafts of the essays and the ones that you'll see in the final report is that we should be designing with accessibility right from the beginning, that we should not be producing our report or our graph or our dashboard or our website or whatever it may be, and then wait to the end to say, oh, we should have thought about writing better alt text or thinking about a better color palette or thinking about how our users may not be able to use a mouse and may need to keystroke through this dashboard. And we see, I think all of us have seen the problems with this, not just in terms of not prioritizing different members of our audiences, but also how costly that is, where you end up at the end of a project and you have to, in many ways, in a lot of projects, you kind of have to start all over. I think anyone who's tried to do a real accessibility audit, which Larene writes about in her essay, you find if you mess something up, depending on what tool you're using, Adobe, you kind of have to go back from the beginning and start all over again. So designing with accessibility in mind from the beginning really, I think is for me at least, is the main theme that comes through the entire body of work. Accessibility shouldn't be a specialty. You don't necessarily need to have a single person in your team or in your organization who it's their responsibility to incorporate your accessibility guidelines or your accessibility needs. And I'll tell you a quick story. When Alice years ago was working at Urban, before I got sad and she left, we were designing guidelines for our blog authors. And one of the guidelines, and we were revising these guidelines, and one of the things that we put into the guidelines was that our authors should be responsible for writing the alt text. And we had a lot of debate about this because a lot of the editors felt that maybe they should just write the alt text. So it's just easier for the authors. They're going to have to edit it anyway. So maybe they should just do it. And Alice made a really good point that by requiring the authors to write their own alt text, they're the content, they're in charge of content, so they should be writing the alt text. But by forcing them to write the alt text, you prioritize the need to do that in all of your work, and you make that a fundamental part of the work focus and the work product. The third theme that comes through is there's not really an established definition for what makes data viz or data visualization accessible. And Frank has done, and Doug have both done a lot of work in this area. Frank is, as probably many of you know, has created Chartability, which I'll try to get some links in here in a little bit, that can give you sort of a guide to making your data visualizations accessible, but it's not an answer. And if there was an answer, I don't think we would need to have this meetup. We would just have a checklist and we would just all follow it. And that's not quite true. And I'll also just make a little side, maybe opinionated comment here, that I think in general, the data visualization field, we focus far too much and exclusively on vision impairments around color. There are lots of other accessibility considerations to keep in mind. Low vision, challenges with physical impairments, challenges, I would even add in access to broadband and the internet. If you live in a rural community in the United States, you may not have high-speed internet. So that great website that you just built and has all your lovely D3 visualizations spinning around, there's like 40 million people in the United States who are not going to be able to access that thing because they do not have broadband internet. And I think this is my last note, two more themes. The fifth, I lost count already. So the fourth theme here is that we need, as visualization creators, and as folks, I think primarily, in this room are primarily, I would guess, kind of identify with like quantitative work, working with numbers and with data. We sort of lose the fact that there are people behind those data. There are people who are going to be looking at our visualizations. And so we need to engage with our audience and we need to engage with people with disabilities so that we could learn and create visualizations and create digital products that they can use. And Larene, I think, has a great, in the report, has a great guide on how to start thinking about doing that sort of usability testing. And the last theme, at least that comes through for me, is that there's not a single right answer for writing alt text. And Liz and others have a couple of chapters in the guide on techniques and models for writing alt text, but there isn't an answer. And the other thing that kind of comes out for me in this whole body of work is that our goal in creating all accessible products is to create an experience for people who have disabilities similar to those to people who do not have disabilities. And that is our goal, so that people have that similar experience. And I grabbed this quote. I'm going to give you a second just to read this from Feng's chapter. I'm going to give you just a second here. And I think this is a good way to think about your ways of implementing accessibility into your work. That I'll just read it here. Not everyone with disabilities will encounter barriers with data visualizations, but I want to encourage you to consider that most people with disabilities might. And so if we think about broadening our audience, I think we're going to end up with better products, better projects, and ultimately that our work and our recommendations will be implemented. So before I hand it over to Sue, I just wanted to note that we have several more Do No Harm guides coming up. The next one coming out in shortly, whenever I can get it finished, will be on collecting, analyzing, reporting data around gender and sexuality. And then we have 2 more collected volumes that'll be hopefully out by the end of the year. We don't have a good name for the one on the bottom left, but it's the follow-up to the one we did in September. So it's like volume 2 of volume 2. And we don't know if that should be volume 2 squared or volume 4, which are all the same, but we just haven't figured out a good title. And then we're doing one on international perspectives on data and data equity. So that hopefully gives you a framework and setting the stage for tonight. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Sue to talk about Urban's broader work in the disability space, and then we're going to then we'll have our discussion. Okay, Sue, over to you.
All right, thanks, John. So I'm going to introduce you to Urban's Disability Equity Policy Initiative, which this work was part of. I'm going to say a little bit about myself. I'm the co-director of our new, this is a very new initiative that we call DEPI. I am the co-director, and my background actually is in housing. And I am not a quantitative researcher, nor do I know a thing about data viz. So this has been a really exciting and learning experience for me. We started DEPI, if you want to go to the next slide. We started DEPI a year ago with funding from the Ford Foundation. And our goal really, the reason I got involved with this, I told you I'm a housing researcher, and I had done some research on housing for people with disabilities and housing for older adults. But I'm also the co-lead of Urban Institute's Disability Affinity Group. And that led me, the internal advocacy led me to thinking about why aren't we doing disability work in a more collaborative way. And you couldn't tell by looking at our website that we did any disability related work at that point. We were lucky enough to be able to bring Judy Human to come in, the disability rights activist, to come in and do an internal event or an external event with us. And she really helped me push Urban Institute's leadership about why we should have a disability equity policy initiative and why Urban needed to establish themselves in this space, because I really think it's part of, we have a big emphasis on equity and structural racism and racial equity, and disability equity is another aspect of equity that we really should be looking at across all of our work. So I was thrilled that John was doing this because it fit right in. We are housed within Urban's Office of Race and Equity Research, which is also pretty new. I think it's a year older than DEPI, which is providing technical assistance to researchers across Urban to disaggregate data and take a racial equity approach to their work, no matter what they're doing. We have 11 different policy centers that range housing, health, justice, all kinds of things. So it's trying to get everybody to focus on these core issues. We are encouraging researchers to bring a disability lens to their work. We're trying to conduct research that will inform policy. And also, I said I started from a place of internal advocacy, elevate the expertise of disabled researchers like me at Urban Institute. I think that is, we want to reflect the spirit of the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. We'll go to the next one. I can talk a little bit about what we've been doing. I am the short presentation, I promise you. We are funded by the Ford Foundation's Disability Justice Initiative, which is maybe 2 years older than DEPI. Disability justice and disability equity work has really taken off dramatically in the last few years. And I think we are right. we are, as we should be, following that trend. We were tasked with 3 initial focus areas. The first was looking at housing for people with disabilities. We did do a big data analysis on the barriers to housing systems for people with disabilities. We are doing some work on immigrants and disability, and hoping to do some work on services for people with disabilities in rural communities. As John mentioned, that's a particularly challenging area, lack of broadband, also lack of data. I think that's true on immigrants as well. And generally, I could say across the board, there is a lack of data on disability that we don't collect it well. We leave a lot of people out of our data sets. We leave anyone who's in an institution out of our data sets. So we are missing we leave people who are not unhoused out of our data sets. So we are missing large swaths of the disability community who could benefit from safety net programs. Some of the work we're doing now is a new collaboration on long COVID, looking at long COVID and the impact of material hardship of long COVID. We're doing some work on disability and incarceration. We're building internal partnerships across urban, also collaborating with external partners. We're part of something called the Disability Economic Justice Collaborative, which is also funded by Forward and also pretty new. But that has given us connections with disability advocacy groups, a whole range, which is leading to some really exciting possibilities for research. So I was really excited to be asked to be part of this project with John, even though, as I said, I don't know anything about data viz. But I think it was great to learn from people who are thinking about making data accessible to everybody and to learn how that's done. I look forward to hearing more. And John, I'll turn it back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Sue. Appreciate that. I've been throwing some links in the chat for folks if you want to check out some of the work that Sue's been talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it over to Alice to get started. So we are going to, for the next hour or so, have a moderated discussion. But again, I'll encourage you to ask questions. You can. Will, how are we doing this? Are we unmuting people if they want? Is that how we're doing this?
Yeah, we can do that. Or if people want to post their questions in chat, we can read them as well.
Perfect. Yeah. So throw your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand, and Will or Jill can or Yining can unmute you. So I'm going to hand it over to Alice to get us started.
Okay, cool. Thanks, John and Sue. To get us started, I'd like to just get a sense of the lay of the land and ask, what is the state of digital accessibility in general, and how does this relate to data viz accessibility? What are some of the most common accessibility problems that we see when it comes to visualizing and communicating data? So I might toss this question over to Frank to get us started.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I like that Sue already mentioned that data that we have is actually, it's kind of spotty. And the same goes for accessibility. So when I talk about the state of things, it's kind of like the best data we have, but it's actually not very comprehensive when we measure accessibility. We use automated tests for big reports called the Web 8 Million. You can Google that. It's a great report. It's the top 1 million homepages are automatically analyzed every year. And so this is kind of like a really good baseline for seeing how accessibility kind of is going writ large across the web. And it doesn't look good. So this year, the report just came out, I think like a week or a couple weeks ago, this year's 96% of the top 1 million websites contain at least one kind of critical accessibility error, which is really bad. 96% is down from 97%, so slightly trending in a positive direction. But like generally that's not good, right? And also, DQ, which is a company that does accessibility auditing and consulting, they say that, somewhere around the ballpark, about half of any given set of accessibility errors can even be caught using automated methods. So there's this whole other world of accessibility issues that are actually like, more difficult to detect and likely have a larger impact too, because they require a human to evaluate. And those we don't even capture. We don't even know about at a really big scale. So big scale, the web doesn't look good. How does that relate to data viz? In my own work, Chartability, I've done a lot of consulting with different companies and different groups, and even individuals. I've done to date a little more than 100,000 tests on data visualizations using Chartability, and it's about 200 or so visualizations across. And surprisingly, the numbers look really similar. Also very bad, not good. On the web, about 85% of websites have a low contrast failure. So that's when contrast is measured like text on a background. So the text is foreground and then a background color or something. If those don't have enough difference in color, it's considered low contrast. So that's a low vision concern generally. So 85% of websites, low contrast is common. I think we have, minimalist designs out there. And for data visualization, it's 88% in my own work. And then it's 60% of websites have at least one image without alt text. And in data visualization, it's 63%. So those are really similar. But data visualization also has even, accessibility failures with worse rates. I'll just name a few of them. Let's see, I'm looking at my list here. Interactive elements are too small. Data visualization will have like a scatter plot with a teeny point. Actually need a minimum size for things, especially if you expect like a mouse interaction. Not having guidelines, explanations, cues, titles, or text accompanying visualizations. Overriding or not respecting user set styling, like a lot of users have vestibular disorder, so they ask for like animations to be turned off and they want higher contrast, or they will change their text size. A lot of data visualizations fail those miserably. There's a whole bunch of other things, but just to kind of set the stage, things don't look good. And it's pretty rough out there. And things actually, if you look at the Web 8 million, have really not trended significantly in a positive direction. So yeah, just to set the stage.
Thanks, Frank. So I see Karen asked this. Oh, Doug, I don't know if you can chime in if you want.
Very briefly about what Sue said about the lack of data collection. I'm working with some educators locally, I mean, in the United States. And one of the things that surfaced is that when we report information about K through 12, when schools report information about K through 12 students who have disabilities, if a student is blind, they say the student is blind and here is how they're performing relative to their grade level, et cetera. If a student has multiple disabilities, which is really common, then they're just lumped under multiple disabilities, right? You can't visualize data you don't have, right? And that's, so I just to pile on to what Sue said, we really need to improve how we're collecting information about people with disabilities.
Absolutely. So Karen had asked a question in the chat window about best places to start. I've put in a few links, but obviously others should feel free. I haven't put in Chartability yet, but I'll get there. I will say that the one place that I have learned a lot, in addition to the folks that you are meeting tonight, is from Dax Castro, who also wrote a chapter in the volume Couldn't Be Here Tonight. I've taken a couple of Dax classes on accessibility, creating accessible PDF documents and other things, and they're amazing. And like in 3 hours, you're not going to be an expert, but you are going to. It's going to blow your mind about how much you don't know about creating accessible. In the class that I took, accessible documents. So we sort of have this stage set. I want to turn to alt text because I know this is a big consideration for those of us putting images and other things on the web, and I want to turn to Liz to start and ask Liz, what in your mind makes an alt text for a data visualization effective?
I think you're muted, Liz. There you go. Hi. Just a little bit of context. Many of the people here make it their life's work to make data visualizations and the internet and research accessible. My life's work is actually, I'm a scientist and I am blind and I am a user of the materials that that people put out, my perspective is mostly that of a scientist reading scientific literature and things like that. Although in the last few years, there's an explosion of data visualizations in media with COVID and election maps and things like that. So as a reader of alt text, the bottom line really is tell me why you're including that image in your media, whether it's the picture of your dog that you're posting on Twitter or the results of your long scientific research project. I want to know what that image shows. And not just kind of a list of what's in the image. I know there's a lot of emphasis with alt text on being brief in a lot of the guides that you'll read about it. For data visualization, sometimes they're really complex. I wouldn't go with the idea that a 1 or 2 sentence explanation is going to be enough. For data visualizations, I encourage people to start out with what kind of graph or plot or chart it is, and orient the reader to things like what's on which axes, how big the quantities are. But then the part that really will never be able to be done, automatically is what are the trends that you can see in the data? Because that's why you're sharing it in your article or dissertation or social media. I see a lot of missing alt texts, as Frank described. I see a lot of frustratingly incomplete alt texts where they might tell me the title, they might tell me the caption, but at least in traditional academic journal articles, the caption doesn't actually describe what the data are showing. It may describe the experiment, it may be a general label, but it doesn't actually help you know why that visualization was included in the article. So yeah, it's important to build up kind of an orientation and framework so that someone knows what kind of graph it is and what kind of information it might be showing, what kind of variables are there, but you need to follow through and tell me what the point is. And I think I'll leave it there and let people ask questions.
Thanks, Liz. I'll open this up because there is a lot to alt text and there's a lot to discuss. So I'll just leave it to see if Frank or Doug or Larene have additional comments or if there's any other questions from folks. I mean, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
First, I want to drop into the chat a link to Amy Cecil's excellent article, Writing to Alt Text for Data Visualization, in which she says the alt text, she proposes as one good framework, and I agree with it in general. Chart type of data where reason for including chart, and then include a link to the data source. That's a good starting point for an accessible for an alt text for a chart. I'm certainly going to defer to Liz because she's experienced more alt text than I ever hope I do. And she specifically has sort of the expertise of being a scientist who knows, who's encountered what they need to know about the data. But I am going to jump on the brevity tip because I have ADHD. That's my special power, right? It is that I have attention deficit disorder, right? And a lot of people who, well, I'll just say cognitive load and cognitive accessibility is going to cross across all disabilities. Everybody has a maximum amount of cognitive load they can process. And I think there is a real risk in alt text overwhelming the reader with too much unstructured information. They say just a string of text, a string of prose that somebody's meant to build a mental image of the chart with. And I would say that, as Liz said, alt text should have the high level takeaway, the trends, what your point is about the data visualization, because that's the first thing a person with a screen reader using a screen reader is going to encounter. But I would say that the details should be made available in either an accessible chart, something that somebody can explore, or a data table, or a long description, probably in that order. I think it's really important that we have alt text. Again, it's the first thing somebody's going to encounter. But if you're only thinking about alt text, you're probably doing it wrong. Data viz should really be inherently accessible by itself. In case somebody wants to drill into details, the alt text should tell them whether they want to go into the details. And if they don't, they can just skip over it. You should respect your reader's time and their attention and mind your own cognitive load. So that's what I have to say about alt text.
Can I also add a point, or are we moving on?
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, cool.
I think this is, I just want to say, I think this is one of the biggest places. Well, let me just preface this by saying, I think this is one of the places that everybody interested in doing better with their work can start right here, right? Every time you put a static graph on Twitter or on a website, this is the place where you can start right away. And so I think this is a super important part of this discussion.
I see some really great discussion in chat, and I want to note that in my piece, I talk about like selecting tools and thinking about tools, and but I also have a point where I talk about context. And context, one of the reasons why there's no right answer for alt text, like how do you write it, is because you might be writing to an academic audience, and your readers. Cynthia Bennett talks about this. She's a blind researcher as well, and she talks about how when she encounters a figure, she wants every detail. And that's because she needs to know as a peer reviewer whether or not this research is solid. And so if she doesn't get a table, she needs to get everything from the alt text. And so considering who your audience is, or your intended audience, and what sort of information they're going to want is also really important. I think Doug brings up a really good point, though, about structure. And I just want to make a note about alt text as a thing, as a practice. Alt text is actually it's an attribute we add to images. And what it really is attempting is a description, an image description. Alt text is how we do it. Image description is the ideal, right? But image descriptions don't just have to use alt. You can write a really good image description that is not attached to the image. I think you can build context, you can have a well-structured document, and sighted people can also benefit from visually provided chart descriptions. But the great thing about chart descriptions is you can structure them like a document or an application or whatever else. You can be much more rich with your description and how you organize it than just alt. So know that there's a balance there, because on social media, you might see NASA's tweets where they have super rich descriptions. They're amazing, really scientifically accurate. And they put everything in alt because that's all Twitter lets you do. And so just know your context, the technology you're working with, it kind of all plays a weird role in the mix of things. And the goal is to really just think about your users and really what are they actually going to want from the thing you're showing.
Ditto, Frank, but I also want to add the last bit of Amy Cecil's advice is to provide a link to the data source. And I'll add to that, if you're in a position where you can only provide alt text because that's the only thing the platform allows, you've only got a static image, give a link to a more dynamic structured document that that you have elsewhere, either an accessible data viz or something else structured, as Frank mentions. It's the web, y'all. We have links.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to note that you shouldn't put the link in the alt text itself because the screen reader can't navigate there.
No. That's thank you, Liz. That's not an interruption. It's an important detail. Yeah, links go in information. Links go in link elements.
Right.
With good
right. People
with
put
good
them in alt
text
text.
as
They
well.
do.
There are some great questions coming in the chat window. Some of them we're going to get to. I'll keep trying to bring some of them up that we don't yet have thought on. I want to ask maybe I'll hand it back to Alice, and I'm going to stop talking now.
Oh, okay. So I'd just like to kind of build on what we've heard Doug and Frank both mention, right? Like data viz should be inherently accessible. Alt text is an imperfect solution, right? And there's a limitation to what it can convey about a rich, dynamic, potentially dynamic data visualization. So I was just wondering if we could also take a step back and talk about what is like a workflow for creating an accessible data viz. And I might hand that to Larene first to talk about.
Thanks, Alice. So yeah, I think it's been touched on a little bit by what folks have been saying before, but I want to kind of bust one myth that designing with accessibility in mind is not trying to create a one-size-fits-all solution. And so the viz part of data viz helps people who are visually minded and get information easier from visualizations, where text is for folks who are able to get information easier from text, and just providing those different options. That is what accessibility is all about, and that comes with providing the raw data as well, and just providing all these different options to allow people to have the choice to consume what they need to consume from what you are giving. So that's I find, and I myself made the same kind of assumption when I first started with accessibility a while ago, is that you kind of have to like get everyone on the same path and make that path completely accessible. It's not the case at all. It's offering different paths, but all achieving the same goal, all achieving what people want to achieve. They might have different goals as well. So I want to talk a little bit. So that's just a bit of something to start off with. I want to talk a bit about workflows. I'm a software engineer. I build and have worked quite often with dynamic charts, dashboards, and stuff. I build stuff mainly in JavaScript and bespoke. I want to get a bit of a gauge of how many folks here kind of work with like Tableau and Power BI. Unfortunately, I don't have so much experience with that, but we have some links, and Frank and Doug know folks who are awesome accessibility advocates who work with Power BI and Tableau. So hopefully we can share the resources to kind of cover that. But could I maybe get, oh, we've got R as well, great. I used to work with MATLAB and R. Okay, cool. So I think very often, I guess a common workflow is you want to output a static image. And so we've touched on that with alt text and stuff. But I think and John mentioned this earlier, building it with accessibility in mind, something to think about is ultimately, what is the goal of the visualization? What are you trying to do with that? So putting your content designer or user experience design hat on, like what is the person consuming that going to take away? What are you hoping the audience is going to take away? That is the ultimate goal of what you're trying to do. But we're trying to represent data, right? That is hard to understand. And Liz mentioned like the trends are the most important thing. Like what is the takeaway? What are the trends? And those who are take away things faster with visuals, picking the right visual is very, very important as well. So again, with the content design hat on, what type of chart is going to be most beneficial for the data that you're presenting is a super, super important thing. And I find, and I've done a lot of work in data viz. I was a researcher back at uni, so I find we kind of data viz creators have a lot of emotional attachment to our charts, and we want to make them super awesome and present as much information to people as possible, and just make our charts really, really full of stuff, full of information, because we want to just be so generous and give everything. But actually, in most cases, and this does change, folks don't care. They're trying to find out how likely they're going to get COVID or something. So a one-liner in text with a heading that summarizes the chart. So your chart may not even need to be there is possibly the most important thing. And so focusing on that I think helps to really make the design of the chart and puts constraints on the design of the chart and why you're putting it in there. And sometimes you don't even need a chart, you just need a number, which is still a data visualization technique as well. So yeah, doing all of that planning up front and going, what is the goal? And I think that kind of flows into the design afterwards. And yeah, it's mentioned earlier, including the raw data or in a link to a table of the same information. And in a lot of kind of government sites that I've seen, picking a known kind of accessible JavaScript framework. One very popular one is HighCharts. I'm happy to drop a link of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They use HighCharts, but they show information and they share information in so many different formats. They have a paragraph of text, they have tables, they have the chart. So you can choose and navigate between which way you desire to consume the information. And it supports folks not just who might not be able to see, but different neurological disabilities, neurodivergence, literacy, culture. It extends beyond just disability and moves into that intersectionality territory, and which is a part of inclusive design. So yeah, you do all that planning and then you make the chart, and it helps to make a lot of decisions for you. And checklists are not everything, but definitely learning about and seeing examples and learning about a bunch of resources that we're sharing today. The Do No Harm article has a lot of great concepts and to start with. Sorry, the book. But as John mentioned earlier, like this, we're all constantly learning. We're discovering new things. This is not an easy thing to do, but the best thing to do is to start and do better than you did yesterday. And progress over perfection is a phrase that is very popularly thrown around at the moment. And it's true. It's true. I think a lot of folks get caught up in doing accessibility perfectly because we think, fine, this is so important, which it is. But it really blocks people from actually doing it because they want to do it the right way. And we all, even folks who have been doing it for 15, 20 years, make mistakes still. The important thing, and John mentioned this earlier, is usability testing and shifting accessibility earlier in the process and involving people with disabilities earlier in the process. Usability testing at the end of building a website or a data viz is a great start, but we should be working together to move that process earlier, getting a diverse team involved in the planning, the ideation, the and ultimately creating an organization that has a diverse team of that you can work together on. That's my ramble. My coffee hasn't obviously set in so well yet. Yeah, I'll share the example for the Australian Bureau of Statistics in the chat, but generally there's no easy answer. Learn a bunch of stuff and do a bit of planning and just try to create a more accessible viz than you did yesterday.
Great advice, Larene. So a lot of questions in the chat. I think we want to try to get to some of these sort of like, how is AI going to affect our creation and work with alt text and accessibility needs. The one that I wanted to make sure we definitely got to was, and there are a couple of questions about interactive or animated data visualizations and how we should think about accessibility when it comes to those, because it's not like a PNG image where you can add alt text so easily and just kind of move on. So I thought, Frank, you've already mentioned this a little bit, but I'm going to turn it back to you. That's a pretty broad question, and maybe there isn't a single answer or simple answer, but I'll just pop that over to you and give you the floor for a while.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the broad area of like non-static charts it's expansive, right? What we are doing nowadays with visualizations is pretty cool stuff. We have live data feeding in to visualizations. That's hard to design for. We have data visualizations you can interact with. You can click something in a visualization or drag, and then it does some kind of selection or filtering, or it, takes you somewhere. So that's also pretty exciting, but also hard to design for. And then we have animations. And I would say that these sort of three areas are what I would say make a visualization non-static. There's probably some other stuff, but those are like the main ones. And in general, my shortest answer to this is that the tool actually makes one of the biggest differences when you get to this point. When you're making static charts, you can use almost anything. And then if you provide, good textual descriptions around it, good alt text, provide a link to the data, you generally kind of try and use like strong contrast and not too many colors, like you're doing really good. But when it comes to interactivity, a lot of tools make decisions for you for how that thing is made. So underneath the hood, when you kind of peel these interactive or animated things apart, all the moving parts underneath actually kind of need to have accessibility built in mind. Like they need to have accessibility embedded into the design of how that machine works, so to speak. And you can do stuff from scratch, like bespoke, accessible data visualizations. I've done work in that space. It's fun, but it's hard, takes a long time. And so a lot of us, we use tools to help us speed up the process for this kind of work. And I would say that if the tools aren't kind of accessible by default out of the box and don't give you a lot of expressive control over how do you decide someone who uses a keyboard or a screen reader navigates through your chart, like if you don't have a way to kind of, as the developer and designer, interact with that, you're going to get whatever the tool gives you, right? And oftentimes it's not very good. And so really, the big point that I make in my article is just that we need to have better tools. We need to push our tool makers to do a better job. And we need to do a better job selecting the right tool for the job. So kind of that's my simpler answer, but really there's a lot of concerns. And I think maybe I'll leave it up to chat for specifics, like specifically in this context. And I'd be happy to give advice, or the rest of the panelists can also jump in too.
Thanks, Frank. I am going to open up to anyone else, and I'm going to apologize right away because I have to run. I have unforeseen child driving duties to do. Thank you all so much, leaving you in very capable hands. And
Thank you, John.
thank you all.
I just want to mention briefly, I saw a comment that animation is a distraction, and it absolutely can be. Animation to dataviz can be a distraction. It absolutely can be. But it can also help direct people's attention. It can be used as emphasis. There are lots of actually good reasons to use accessibility in dataviz. I talk about them in my chapter. I don't want to go into too many details here, but read the chapter. And there's other people who have written about this as well. Frank probably knows some good advice there, some good things. Maybe he can drop some links. But I also wanted to mention something that Larene just jump on something that Larene said, which is one size does not fit all. Absolutely true. And one aspect of that is that people think of people with vision disabilities as sort of a monolithic block. But in fact, a lot of people who are legally blind have low vision, and data visualizations are often much, much better for a person with low vision than, say, a table or a spreadsheet would be, because large blocks of color help them distinguish trends and things like that that would be very difficult for them to see in a spreadsheet. So do think about different disabilities than colorblindness and blindness. There's a whole world out there, and we talk about that in the book.
Thanks, Doug. I did see a question, since Frankie were talking a little bit about tools, and someone did follow up in the chat with, are there any tools that you could recommend? Or just, I see that people are working with a variety of tools. Any thoughts, pros and cons, or how best do you work within the limitations of the tools that you use to make more accessible charts and data viz?
Yeah, is that directed at me? I could jump on
It's
it.
open to anybody at this point.
Okay. Anybody could jump in. I have three that I kind of like highlight: Visa chart components, high charts, and SAS. Actually, like SAS Graphics Accelerator is really good. The team at SAS, I think, is kind of, underappreciated. They do really good work and have done good work for a long time. I would say those are three good tools, but an important thing to keep in mind is that your tools really do, they don't need to be a rocket ship. So data wrapper for journalists is actually usually a really appropriate option, just as an example of one domain of work and a tool that does a pretty good job for them, because you get a link to the data that's good for all kinds of reasons in journalism. You get to provide alt text. It helps you pick good colors. So that's just a really great tool, but it's not, it doesn't provide extremely robust support. And for really complex visualizations, you might want to use a different tool to build animations or interactivity. So yeah, there's other things out there, but I would say those four are kind of my favorites. There's others though, I'm sort of biased.
I'll just jump in and say, I don't know how many folks are working with JavaScript libraries here. It seems like there's a few because there's a bit of a mention in the chat. We've hit a lot of dashboards and dynamic charts in audits, and found that there's a bunch of libraries that are open source, which is great. People are spending volunteering their time to build these amazingly useful libraries. Unfortunately, most of them do not consider accessibility. And a check that I usually do is going into the GitHub issues of that library. If you're familiar with GitHub, and just seeing if there's any accessibility issues that have been raised. And I'll also go to the documentation of that library and look if they mention accessibility at all. And if they don't, generally that's a pretty good sign that it's not a library that's been built with any accessibility features. And usually we end up suggesting to use high charts or Visa components. I've mentioned Visa components, heaps Frank. And either to use those libraries directly or to use them as a reference to understand what good looks like and be able to build your own, because there's a lot of very talented JavaScript engineers around, and they can generally kind of take something and run with it. But yeah, that's the checks that I do, and usually, generally, unfortunately, a lot of open source libraries don't consider accessibility. But there's some that are close as well that if you have the time and I try to contribute to as well. So yeah, that's just a short spiel on JavaScript. I'm about to post a link to a list of references in a GitHub repo that includes those tools that Frank just mentioned. So I'll put that into the chat.
Awesome, thanks, Larene. I also want to go back to, I think, a question we saw came through earlier, but right now a lot of AI has been in the news, right? ChatGPT, generative AI. What role, if there even is one, do you all feel these sorts of things have in making more accessible data viz? I think some people are viewing them as a potential way to write alt text, for example. So yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And this is also open to anybody.
I have a really good example of a bad example. I was doing a tutorial on using PowerPoint because it's not a tool I use very often, and I was going through this tutorial, and it was doing step-by-step this PowerPoint about drones. It was a drone company. So I was just following along the step-by-steps. And then I encountered there was an image and I wanted to add alt text to it. And I was like, oh, Microsoft's got this really cool thing that can describe an image. And the description that came, the automatic alt text that was generated was amazing. It said, man standing in a field flying a kite. And I was like, that it can pick that up is astounding. And even more amazing is the fact that it was wrong, because of course it was not a man flying a kite. It was a man flying a drone, right? Which it could have known if it had looked at the context of the article that it was looking at, right? And that's really important. Tools should understand. Frank mentioned context earlier. Who is your audience, right? But another aspect of context is what is your data visualization saying with regards to everything around it? This affects what you think about with alt text. This affects how machine learning should work in terms of looking at key terms or references to the image and explaining and using those to enhance the image. To enhance the image description, excuse me. So I really feel like machine learning can be an amazing tool, but a curated machine learning is probably best, right? It can ease some of the burden, but also it might not understand what you're trying to emphasize. It might not understand even really what the point is. Is this a chart that's showing 2 rival companies or 5 rival companies, or is it really emphasizing one specific company, right? There's any number of ways in which machine learning just doesn't have the context to get it right. And so you should probably make sure that what it's saying is what you want it to say.
I might jump in because I know that someone asked about alt text for dynamic charts. Yeah, I think a lot of folks are excited about machine learning as being a potential, or AI being a potential solution to generate alt text for the charts. It might be down the track if you kind of, as Doug mentioned, craft it in the way that you get the results you're expecting from using AI to assist, not to be in charge of, but to assist with making it easier. But to kind of link it back to how we would handle that, how we've been handling it without AI, and I find high charts is another really good example of that. It describes the anatomy of the chart for screen reader users using a template, and then makes the chart navigable for keyboard users and screen reader users. So that's kind of the I guess, non-AI current solution, which I don't think many folks are aware of. But yeah, taking a look at high charts and inspecting the HTML, you will see like how they describe a dynamic chart, and I think that's a really, really great place to start. It's not going to get you to talking about trends and stuff, but generally in dashboards, people are taking away different information from different charts anyway. So what might be kind of trends that are happening, not necessarily going to be the same information that 2 different people looking at a dashboard are looking for. One area I specialize in is kind of observability of systems, software systems, whether stuff is up or down, or how many errors there are. And there are alternative ways to kind of present, the important information, which is you don't want to be staring at charts all day. You don't want to be monitoring charts all day. You want to get an alert when stuff goes down, and that doesn't need a chart. So considering kind of the use case of dynamic charts and what they're for. But that's what I've worked in. I wouldn't know what to do for like stocks and stuff. That's really tough.
One thing, I think you really hit on it. Dashboards are very, very often used for status updates, right? And then let you drill into the status updates. Figure out in your dashboard what the most important status thing is, and just use ARIA Live to tell the person, hey, this thing has changed, especially if there are thresholds that it needs to stay within. That's relatively easy. Oh, I'm seeing people are leaving. How long is this thing?
I believe it's scheduled till 8.
Until
Eastern
8.
time.
Yep. Yeah, we
Okay.
got time. Some folks just need to leave early.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this goes back to determining what is the purpose of your visualization. What is the user experience you want to have? It helps determine what you need to do to make it accessible, right? Also curious to know what y'all's thoughts are on activating other senses, right? I think someone also mentioned in the chat, like sonification and haptics. Are there other ways we can engage other senses as a way to make visualizations more accessible?
Can I address this?
Of
Somebody else?
course, yeah.
Go for it.
So I know Larene is also really interested in haptics. I'm working with a company called View Plus. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they make embossing printers, and they're printers, right? They are not animated, they're not dynamic, right? But basically what it does is it prints out a raised surface of the data viz, right? And then you can put that piece of paper, and there are lots of ways of making tactile printouts, but their printers are pretty good. You can put that piece of paper on top of a touch screen, and then as you move your fingers around the different parts of the touch screen, the different parts of the image, it can actually enhance the tactile with labels and details and things like that. And that is a really cool technology. We aren't yet, unfortunately, at the point where we have really good dynamic tactile tablets. In other words, things that, raised pins. They exist. They're kind of clunky and very expensive, like $15,000. Hopefully somebody will come up with a better technology. But it is, tactiles can be really, really effective at giving somebody a sense of the gist, giving somebody a sense of the space. But you have to be careful with tactiles, because if a person was born blind, they don't necessarily have a really good sense of what something flattened looks like, right? So be careful with what you're doing with tactiles there. And sonification, I'm going to be spicy, as Frank would say, and say, I love sonification, and I can think it can be really, really useful in certain cases. You have to be really well trained to get a lot of data out of a sonification, and sonification has to be really well done. They are good for gists. They are good for first impressions. They're not really great they can be useful for exploring data, when also used with like voiceover stuff, voicing things. But I would not rely on sonifications for most imparting of data, because it's very imprecise and most people don't know really how to interpret them. But I'd really be interested in hearing what Liz has to say. If Liz is still on.
I think Liz stepped out.
Oh, that's too bad, because of course I'm not blind. She would know better how to do this. But I'm interested in anybody else's impressions of sonification. I think sonification is a great enhancement and supplementary technology. I don't think it's a great first answer to data viz. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Doug. I recently had a chat with a friend who is blind, has been blind from birth, and she's really interested in sonification, and kind of spends a lot of time reading about it. And she shared with me a bunch of stuff, but one thing in particular was a university did sonification of a hurricane moving through a certain point in a location and the different sounds associated with that. And she thought that was super interesting, but still had no idea what was going on because there was no, there was different sounds, but there was no kind of explanation.
It's super compelling, right? It's like looking at a really beautiful data visualization that you don't understand, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But that's not to discourage like work and research in this area, but absolutely always work with the folks that it's for, and don't try to kind of build it in a vacuum. And another friend who I think was also blind from birth is 3D printing planets to understand their terrain, and that's really cool. Tactile is something that I'm interested in. As Doug mentioned, I have a 3D printer that's sitting there collecting dust, and I've been meaning to kind of explore that tactile, working with friends in that tactile, and volunteer to use my printer because it takes a very long time to print anything. But yeah, again, as Stu mentioned earlier, nothing about us without us. Don't do anything without involving and working closely with the folks who need it. So
yeah, I also wanted to at least say a few things about sonification and some other stuff. I've been reading on this lately. I'm a PhD student, so I do a lot of reading. Sometimes it's not very useful, but I've been reading about sonification and auditory perception, right? And so I think just something to be said before we get too deep into like topics of sensory substitution, where you may have a visual and you try and substitute it with sound or a tactile or haptics or something else, is to know that there is no such thing as one-to-one sensory substitution. Any change in senses comes with different cognitive like functions that are associated with that sense. We're like faster or more accurate with certain things, with certain senses. We also have constructed different models of understanding different like sensory input. So just know that you can't just have even a tactile that looks pretty similar to a data viz. And as Doug already sort of mentioned, will just not have a one-to-one translation. So just know that it shouldn't serve a substitutory effect, but we can still use it in really powerful ways. But then on sonification, the interesting thing about sonification that is cool, but a big limitation cognitively, is that it is ephemeral and transient. And unlike many other things like tactiles and visuals, is that once the sound is gone, it's gone. And that's one of the biggest cognitive barriers to using sound as opposed to other materials for representing data, is that you have to sort of remember the sounds you heard and then reconstruct a story, which is cognitively actually very difficult. So there are some things where sonification is apparently good, according to research. Doug already kind of mentioned them. There's some other kind of cool things that people do with it, but also alerts, right? If you're building a dashboard and something goes down, sound is actually really good at getting our attention quickly. But anyway, just wanted to at least say that stuff.
Okay, so sorry, two things that, Frank, the thing about it being ephemeral is really important, because structured documents, if you can go back and listen to a number, right? And that number will not have changed. But if you go back and listen to the sound of that number, it's missing the context of the previous and next sounds. It is ephemeral in a way that text, for example, is not ephemeral, right? Even if text is serial in the same way that sonification is serial, it is not ephemeral in the sense that sonification is ephemeral.
Yeah, one of the things that's hard, somebody was talking about maps or a hurricane. It was a hurricane, and that was you, Larene, right? So like sound doesn't easily have a location in a digital context, but in real life, sound is actually very good and helping us understand location. And so there's also a loss of this really important dimension that we use sound for in real life that we've evolved to be pretty good at, that we miss when we try and sonify. And it's also hard to use location in a way to kind of represent data dimensions and other stuff. That plays into the ephemerality of sound as well, and locating stuff. Yeah.
And then there's a second thing I wanted to mention, which is Frank mentioned like alert sounds, and technically experts in sonification don't call those sonification. They call them ear cons, or there's a whole other set of things that those, and they're super effective, right? Like when an email gets sent, that sound, or the trash, right? There's lots of or just a message has come in. Those technically aren't sonifications. They're another category of auditory alert, like auditory input. But they can be used with sonifications, and they themselves are very effective as well. So, but again, that leads back to the ephemerality, right? That's just to notify you of something. It's a confirmation, it's feedback. It's not imparting data, it's imparting information.
Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like, there's definitely some interesting potential, but we need to be careful that we aren't just applying the paradigm we use when we visualize data and try to just translate that directly to how we might use other kinds of senses. One last topic I'd like to shift to, going back to something, Larene, you mentioned about working with people, working with users. For someone looking to get started on how can we do work with people with disabilities, users with disabilities, how would you advise someone who's looking to start doing that? How should they go about doing that? What advice do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. A great place to start is to there's two ways you can go, and usually you can do them at the same company, but engaging an accessibility consultancy like one I work for, Intopia. There's someone mentioned DQ earlier. I know America has Level Access. Probably shouldn't be mentioning competitors, but I'll mention a few more. And Tetralogical is run by Larene, which is one of the co-authors on this paper as well. And she's in the UK. And there's a really big group, cool startup in the US called Fable. They specialize in usability testing. But kind of Googling like usability testing or talking to these accessibility consultancies, they'll be able to point you towards organizations that facilitate usability testings with people who use various assistive technologies who have various disabilities, which is a really great place to start. Doing an audit is a really great place to start as well. The accessibility journey is long, as we mentioned, as Frank mentioned at the start of this panel. This current state of things, it's not good, and there is that training element of learning about this, and you can't kind of learn it overnight. I wish we could, but you can't. It's moving a lot of levers and putting a lot of systems in place to make accessibility the path of least resistance, the easiest thing to do and the default. And that's taken a long time, and it will take a long time, but it's why we do things like this and raise awareness and kind of point people in the direction. So there is that education and training element first, and then doing an audit to see kind of where you're at in terms of how you went with building your data viz is usually a part of a larger product like a website or an app or whatnot. So getting that audited and finding other accessibility issues is a really good place to start and worth it. And so you have an idea of what to do next, and then a strategy to kind of work out: do we do training? Do we do what do we need to learn to be able to make our organization an accessibility mature one? But yeah, reach out, Google accessibility consulting or accessibility auditing in your area, have a chat, it's hopefully a start of a very long and but for good journey. One thing did want to bring up, and I'm part of a accessibility Slack. I know Frank and Doug are in there as well. And so there's a whole bunch of people in there who are happy to support anyone who's interested on this journey. And there's a channel in there, but I'll drop it into the chat, more details into the chat, and an invite link as well. And I've joined the DataViz DC chat if I'm happy to answer any questions. So yeah, I'll drop that in. Hope that helps. Hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, Doug or Frank, do you all have any advice for people who want to get started on this?
Yeah, I think there's just one tiny little extra bonus. Well, maybe two things. One is that like building relationships with people who have disabilities is a kind of maybe one of the most important first steps. I think not everybody here probably works for a big company that can host like external consultants or like bring in bigger groups, but actually there's a lot of like NLS libraries or libraries for the blind that do a lot of work locally, and just kind of getting plugged in and seeing what local people are up to is actually huge. I love the local, it's a library of accessible media for Pennsylvanians in Pittsburgh. I love those folks. They're super cool. They have like 3D printers and embossers and lots of great stuff. Not every library has those resources, but it's good just to like build relationships and get connected and like learn what people are up to and what they care about. And not that they can become future users, right? But just to develop relationships. I think that that's actually the foundation of like good work in general, is just having relationships. And then the second thing is, anytime you do bring anyone in, like, you should pay them. I think sometimes there's a lot of like financial justice issues in the disability space. People work for free a lot because they're asked to. So just be pretty straightforward. If you cross the line from friend into work, be like, hey, let's pay you for your expertise. So
I want to double what Frank said, and I want to point out that it can be expensive to bring on accessibility professionals, but because they know what they're doing, right? They're professionals. If you're looking to involve people with disabilities in user studies and such, Frank and I actually have had good luck. Every state in the US, if you're in the US, and I assume this is the same elsewhere, every state has a department of rehabilitation or disability aid or whatever. They all have something. And if you contact those people, they can very often put you in touch with people with disabilities that you can do user studies with. Frank and I paid some people like $100 to do user studies on some software we're developing and auditing. And they were not necessarily power users, which is great, right? They were real users, and that's a really good resource that you can find. Also, if anybody's doing studies, like actual like research studies, there is a site called Prolific. It's a little bit like I've used them. I'm not affiliated with them. This is not an advertisement, but they're a little bit like the Amazon's automatic Turk. No, automated Turk.
Mechanical Turk.
Yeah, Mechanical Turk. Thank you. Prolific actually has really great filters on demographics that you can select, and that includes filters on people with disabilities. So that's a really effective way of finding people who you can use in a not expensive way to make sure that you are working with the people that are going to be affected by your software. Or I say software, your content, etc.
Cool. Yeah, those are all really great resources and suggestions. Thank you all. I see we have been at this for an hour, so I will ask one last question and then open it up for Q&A. So last question for our panelists. What is one thing that people here can do as soon as they get off of this call to improve the accessibility of their data viz? Number one thing.
very quick thing, if you have a structured document like an SVG, a D3 document, something like that, do Control A, select all, and then paste it into a text document and listen and like listen to the text document or try to read the text document and see if it makes any sense to you at all. And you'll get a sense of what it would be like for a screen reader user to try to listen to your data viz. If you can't provide a data viz that is accessible and structured and is in a sensible order, hide it from the screen reader user and just use alt text, because otherwise they're just going to get garbage and it may even be difficult for them to navigate around that garbage. That's a really quick thing you can do. And it also gives you some awareness of the structure of a data viz document that, from like D3 or any other SVG library.
Thanks, Doug. Larene, Frank, one thing that people can do right off the bat.
Mine is probably, just start adding alt text, and I guess a good way to be able to practice writing alt text is just, if the image wasn't included at all, what are you trying to get across, and write that down, and also include that in the text of the surrounding report or article or whatnot as well. That's probably the biggest thing. Practice writing alt text on your social media if you're on the amazing place that is Twitter right now, or Mastodon, or LinkedIn, and yeah, it just gets you in the habit. And I find adding alt text makes you also really think about, why you are adding this particular image. I think we've mentioned this earlier, why you're adding this particular image. And then you go, actually, I don't really need to include this image at all. It's not complementing what I'm saying. Maybe I should pick another one, or and yeah, really helps you think about what message you're trying to get across to folks. Yeah, that's probably mine. Frank?
I think I'm going to build off of that and answer a question that just came up in chat at the same time. Okay, so you're writing alt text. How do you test it? Practice using a screen reader. That, I would say, that's like kind of maybe the most intimidating thing that a lot of people new to accessibility are not used to, and it sort of turns them off from just getting started because screen readers can seem really scary. And I would say, just give it a shot. Try and Google like, how do I use a screen reader? There's some pretty, depending on the screen reader, there's some pretty good guides out there. I know that even some folks who are co-authors have even contributed to some good guides out there on this. Are there still like 3 primary screen readers that behave differently? JAWS is the big one. I think like 50% of desktop users use JAWS, and then VoiceOver on mobile is the big one. I think 70% of mobile users use VoiceOver. Those are like the 2 champs in the world of desktop and mobile. And then there's NVDA, which is free on Windows. JAWS costs money. And VoiceOver on Mac, also same VoiceOver, pretty much the same VoiceOver as VoiceOver on iOS, is free on Mac. So there's free options, and then JAWS costs money. So yeah, whatever you have access to, you certainly have options to get stuff for free and give it a shot. Yeah, the short answer though is yes, there are still three big ones out there.
Just a really quick thing, Frank. I'll link some videos that are 10-minute getting started, just to make it easy so you don't have choice fatigue. Get NVDA for Windows because it's free if you're on Windows, and if you're on Mac, VoiceOver is already installed. But definitely don't try them out before watching these videos, so you know how to turn them off. I'll put them into the chat now, but they're also mentioned in my article. Cool.
Very cool. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I guess at this point, we'll open up for more Q&A. If anyone has something they want to just come off mute and ask our panelists. If there are any questions in the chat that we missed that we can get to, yeah, just open up the floor to everyone else here tonight.
And people should be able to unmute themselves now if they're interested in coming off mute and asking a question verbally.
If no one has a question, as a note, this is just a pin. I do have a comment about an earlier thing. So that's just a placeholder if we need it.
Yeah, I think you can go for it. I'm scrolling back through the questions, and I think you addressed them very well in the conversation or replying to them in chat.
So on the earlier question about kind of machine learning, large language models and stuff, there's one point that I think is actually probably pretty good to just really make sure we mention to this audience, folks in DC. I'm sure you're all involved in a lot of pretty high stakes work. And I also want to note that I've done work with practitioners about automated descriptions, just early work, asking them questions about, would you use a description that was automatically generated in this high stakes context? And almost universally, the answer is no. So just understand that when we're thinking about like machine generated descriptions, also really carefully consider risk in the equation. I actually would think generally we should assume the risk is always higher than we think it is, because if we think it's a low stakes context, why are we still now giving people who use screen readers an automated and not human generated description? So there's also kind of a point about like, we still mostly make charts and design broadly with our own intentions. And I just want to pose a question for people to really think about, which is, why do we want to pick our colors for our data visualizations and pick our data and pick our story, but we want a machine to describe it for us? And I think that it's just a really important question to think about, like, why, of all the things that go into the design of a really effective visualization, do we want that one thing to be automated? And, I don't think we can stop large language models. They're just going to happen. But I want us all to be just really thoughtful about that question, about why this area are we going to, kind of be more accepting of automation than everything else that really should go into, a thoughtful visualization design. So I think we should also consider our descriptions as just part of the core design work of visualization.
Frank, I think that's a great point, and I'd like to offer another alternate perspective. I really like that perspective. I think that's something to really ponder. Why do people want? Now, granted, data viz libraries, you usually do come with defaults and things like that, right? It's not strictly we pick everything. Most people who are making a data viz are using the out of the box defaults, and I think that's also legitimate, and we shouldn't shame people for that. But I'm going to mention something. I have skepticism about automatic descriptions, but I will also mention automatic descriptions of free form content are inherently more difficult than structured content, right? Data visualizations follow a template, they follow a pattern, they follow a structure. I think it will be easier in the future, or the near future rather, for machine learning models to be trained specifically on data visualizations because of their structured nature, their visually structured nature. And I think that they will be able to generate good descriptions. I just don't think that we're there yet.
There's this, I'm going to drop it in chat, and a caveat, it's kind of academic. So sorry, but it's really good. In the late 90s, Ben Schneiderman, our own data visualization guru who started many things that, many trends and came up with many great ideas that we all follow and practice. Ben Schneiderman had a debate with Patty Mays on direct manipulation interfaces versus what were called like interface agents. So things that make decisions for us in interfaces. It's a very good and totally relevant thing to read on this conversation of when do we as creators and makers and users of technology still want some semblance of control and the ability to take responsibility for our designs. And then Patty Mays comes in with a perspective on when are interface agents really appropriate. And they're not totally against each other, right? You can have mixes of both. So I just want to say, stew on this. If you want to read further, want to get into slightly more academic kind of world things, I love this piece so much. And it's obviously super relevant still today. I think this PDF is open access. I think anybody can go there.
I also want to mention there's going to be one really big transformation that machine learning and AI is going to affect in accessibility. AI is going to wipe out the human race. And so there will be no more need for us to have any sort of automatic descriptions and things like that. So that's just, I'm just putting it out there.
It's true. We don't need descriptions if we aren't here.
They're going to poison us. It's just we're gone. Sorry. That's not necessarily true. I don't know that for a fact.
But in the meantime, while we're still around.
Somebody says there are always legacy issues. Yeah, they're going to be specifically machine learning. There's going to be AI that were designed around humans, and they're going to miss us, and they're going to be upset with the AIs that wiped us out. That's true. That's true. Okay.
A side note to I guess AI and kind of tools that consume content and data. Machines also have accessibility needs. Yeah, just like if you're putting a document like a PDF CV into LinkedIn, if it's not accessible, the whatever thing in LinkedIn that kind of scrapes your PDF resume is not going to be able to see the text on it either. So that correlates very closely with a PDF being available to screen reader users or blind folks, and being available to a LinkedIn scraper. So it might get rejected immediately. I'm not sure why.
There's a great point that I went and tested just because I was bored and driving, and I sometimes use the Google voice interface just because I'm bored and driving. And what I did is I decided to ask Google who is Frank Elavsky, and it gave the perfect answer. And I was like, wow. And then I was like, oh yeah, I said exactly that statement on my own website. And so then I just started asking other people, who is blah, 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 who is blah, blah, blah. And then I went and checked later, and I did a little accessibility test on some people's websites. And I haven't measured, so don't take this as fact, but some websites with really bad accessibility had some of the worst answers or no answer for who is that person. But people with really clean and crisp and clear HTML that was well structured had better SEO, which is search engine optimization. So just as a plug for your own self-interest, practice on your own personal website. Just make it accessible, and you might get better results on Google.
I also want to go off on a tangent there. That it's not just about machines and SEO. If you consider cognitive accessibility, and you're considering, there is no one size fits all accessibility. That just doesn't exist. Things that are good for people who need high contrast are terrible for people who are dyslexic, right? There actually are trade-offs with accessibility. But if you think about how much cognitive load you are inflicting on your reader, that's going to be good for people without disabilities as well as people with disabilities. If you have somebody else look at your thing and see if they understand it, and if they don't understand it, it's probably also not accessible, right? accessibility is ultimately about making affordances for people who are human, and most of us human, and that is some of the same things are going to be covered for anybody. And so you can, Larene said not to stress too much about making the perfect accessibility. I absolutely agree. And I feel like just getting started with your intuition, you can probably figure out what the biggest issues are if you just think about it. You don't necessarily have to do a lot of research. Just think about what things are and then verify what you're thinking with people who have disabilities.
So I'm gonna plug Doug here. There's an old piece. Doug,
not
don't
that
read
kind of
into
plug.
that too
Okay.
much. All right, geez Louise, this isn't late night with Doug and Frank. Okay, so a great piece by Doug. I'm gonna post it in chat. Accessibility is the heart of data visualization, or why accessibility is the heart of data visualization. I talk about this all the time. I've talked about it for years now, which is weird to think about. But just to kind of note that data isn't very accessible to our brains, right? It's just not. And data visualization is about reducing the barriers produced from understanding data, right? So we're already working to break down barriers. And that is accessibility work. It might not be accessibility work for people with disabilities, but it's access work at its heart. And Doug's piece is so good because he says, why stop? Why not keep going? Why not just continue the heart of what we are already setting out to do? I think it's really compelling. It's a really good piece. I hope that maybe if you don't remember anything from tonight, just be inspired by the fact that we're already trying to break down cognitive barriers, and that we should just keep going. Our work shouldn't stop. It's always the quest.
I want to say that the reason that piece is great is not because of what I wrote, but because I was working with a really good editor.
Nice.
Same thing for my book here. It was much for my chapter of the book. The editing process was grueling. I hated it.
I got obliterated.
I resented it. And it came out and the result was
good.
much better than anything
is
I
good.
would have made. And that is, you might not think that's data visualization. It's not data visualization, but it is structuring data, structuring information in a way that is more easily consumed by people. That's what the editors did for me. And that's what you as data visualization professionals are doing for your readers, is you're doing the heavy lifting for them. And so just think about everybody you're doing the heavy lifting for.
There was a good kind of note in the chat. Okay, good. Save the
that's
transcript, share the chat out. Awesome. Cool.
Yeah,
Yep,
good.
we're on it.
Yay, thank you.
That's so often I've seen great chats just disappear. Talk about ephemeral.
Yeah, talk about ephemeral.
Larene, we still need to hook up about tactiles. We need to find some time to talk.
Yes, we do.
I've been,
Can't
by the
believe
way,
it's April already.
I think time is against me. Go ahead, Frank, you were saying something?
oh, well, don't count me out. I mean, I've been messing around with tools too, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Count me in, I'm in.
Absolutely.
You know those super expensive, refreshable tactile Braille's display you talked about? We managed to snag one, so we have one, and we've been messing around with it.
You
It's
have a
pretty cool.
Monarch?
Not a Monarch, but you know what's under the hood is the dot
Dot
pad.
technology.
We have a dot pad.
Yeah.
So
That's a
the
Korean
precursor to the
company
Monarch.
that
Yep.
is probably going to be in a lot of things.
A
I
long,
think
wild story, but we just reached out, and the VP and co-founder just came to Pittsburgh, and we just had dinner, and he was like, "Here's a dot pad," and we were like, "What? Why would you come here?" All right, let's do it. It was great. Yeah.
I want to say something about those tactile displays. I used one at CSUN, right? I used the Monarch. And it's good. It's improving, but because of the DPI, the visuals on them are utterly distorted, right? They do not look good. They may feel better than they look, but they do not look good.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, an embossed piece of paper, embossing for Braille is you kind of punch holes in paper, sort of, and it creates a raised surface. You can get about 100 DPI dots per inch on embossed paper, which is pretty good. You can have some pretty nuanced shapes. It'll still be a little bumpy. You can't have super smooth lines. Unfortunately, refreshable tactile Braille displays, which have pins that go up and down and it's mechanical, those ones are like 60 pins wide by 40 tall, or some general dimensions like that. And if you think of that in terms of pixels, next time you make a data visualization, try and make one that's 60 pixels wide and 40 pixels tall, and you'll see kind of what you're working with. It's difficult.
Yeah.
I have like a weird, obscure Twitter thread about this from like a while back. It's not a good thread, but I was just stewing on the limitations.
Well, at least it's on Twitter, the forum of public record.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you all so much for the great panel discussion, the awesome event. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but if this does get posted to the internet in due time, thanks to anyone who stuck around to the end.